wind pushing over trees, taking apart homes and buildings, and pushing a ton of water. That is going to remain an absolute danger. The potential for these huge waves and the storm surge from the relentless water is something that virtually everyone in Florida needs to worry about.
Hurricane Dorian still a Category 5 right now. It's parked over Grand Bahama. You know, this is the 27th Atlantic hurricane to reach Category 5 since 1950. Meteorologist Jim Cantori is in Stuart, Florida. He has already seen some of the bands from Dorian come through. We are seeing mandatory evacuations, not only where he is in Florida, but where I'm located in Savannah, Georgia, and coastal South Carolina as well. Welcome back in. We want to give you the very latest. Now, Category 5 winds, 157 or higher. We're at 165. Now, as you look at the pressure, you notice the pressure has gone up just a little bit. Those winds have dropped from 185, where it maxed out, down to 165. So you'll watch that pressure. As it goes up, those winds are going to drop down, and eventually this will start to weaken. Now, when it does weaken, the wind field of these hurricanes expand. So tropical storm hurricane force winds will go farther out. Right now, hurricane force winds about 40 miles from the center. Tropical storm force winds about 100 miles from the center. We expect that to expand. So even if it does stay offshore, that's why you do have those hurricane watches and warnings and tropical storm watches and warnings along the coast of Florida. This is going to be crawling up the coast of Florida. You're going to have to deal with it, not only through Monday, but also Tuesday and lasting into Wednesday. It's going to get up into Georgia and the Carolinas for your Wednesday and Thursday. So this is an all-week event. This is a marathon hurricane that we are following. And, you know, Jim, they sometimes...
I'm out here on the beach right now. We got one of these squalls coming through. Tracy, let's go back to Stephanie to interview Ken Graham, because I'm not going to be able to hear him, and I want to give him due process here with this. So let's go back to you. We're going to get into another area here.
I got it, Jim. Right? Yeah. All right. Get some shelter there from those winds here, and we want to bring in there. But there was a northern little wobble. Was that a wobble, or was that the final trend to go northbound?
Now it's the waiting game, so let's look at some of the timing. We expect overnight tonight some movement, start maybe pulling it to the north. Week, so we're going to wait for that pull. But here's what we got to remember in Florida. So important. It's a timing game. So if it moves a little bit later, you could be closer to the coast. And even so, look at this, 120 miles or so away from the center. You got tropical storm force winds. And if you talk about 40 miles of hurricane force winds and expanding as the wind changes with time, that could definitely impact portions of Florida with hurricane force winds, tropical storm force winds stretching well inland, and the storm surge, of course.
Okay, we only have about 30 seconds left, so let's talk about that water rise and quick rainfall totals. How much are you expecting?
Yeah, rainfall totals so highly dependent on the track, and we mentioned yesterday how that can slide back and forth depending on the track, and it did. So some of these values that we're seeing 6 to 10 inches, but a little bit of a wobble towards the west, and some of these higher values get further inland. So we just got to watch that forecast and be ready for this hurricane.
It is a tough one. It is a tough one, Ken, and I appreciate you coming on in such a busy time for you guys and all the hard work that all of you are doing there at the Hurricane Center. We're going to leave you now with what it looks like to go through one of these outer bands. Remember, we're 100 miles from the center. This is what it looks like in Stuart, where Jim is currently taking some shelter.
It's over. They don't have power. They don't realize that they're in the eye of this thing, and all of a sudden they go out and get the backside of the eye. Big difference.
Yeah. You know, Jim, Dorian also, when it was at that 185, it was the strongest north for any hurricane in the Atlantic. This thing has been record-setting. It will continue to be record-setting. It is a 27th Atlantic hurricane to reach Cat 5 since 1950. So where does it go to next? I want to bring Jen in to talk about that because, Jen, a lot of people are seeing what's happening in the Bahamas, and it's really stressing them out. It's stressful to see other human beings to go through such a horrific, event. But as I mentioned, those morning model runs are still keeping this offshore. So that trend has been to keep this offshore. That's the best news we could get.
Yeah, it's an amazing trend, but we know that we have a long time still to deal with this right here over the Grand Bahama Island. I want to talk actually about forward motion, which is basically nothing, towards the west, by the way. And if it stays at this same motion, it would take more than or close to 2 days for this to completely cross over this island, just based on how long it is, right? It's like 46 miles left to go to cross over the island, if it doesn't pick up some speed or make more of a jog to the Florida. Now, I want to talk about the steering, and this high pressure, which has been the main factor, the main synoptic scale factor steering so far, has really just weakened. It's pulled away. It's not that much of a factor anymore. This was what was really pushing Dorian over towards the west. Now, it is still, generally taking a westward motion, but what we're watching for is this big high pressure and the clockwise flow around it, kind of squashing it down here, preventing it from really going anywhere. That's why it's pretty stationary. So this, for now, is keeping things pretty still. There's a weakness, though, happening between these two that leaves an opening for it to move to the north, and thanks is what we are waiting to see. The models are trending all offshore, all taking up to the north, but we know, based on history, that there's still an option for it to go onshore, which is why the cone still includes eastern Florida, still includes southeastern Georgia into South Carolina. Looking at the timing, I mean, look, this is 3 or 4 days out. There's still a lot of error in the forecast cone when you look back at history. So we have to have patience with this forecast and be ready for changes and plan for the worst case scenario. We're going to get you up to speed now on the latest about what we know. Dorian's rain bands are starting to
Bahama, but of course, this is the third landfall Dorian has made in the Bahamas. The first was over Abacos Island. Dorian terrorizing the Abaco Islands with 185-mile-an-hour winds. The Abacos main town, Marsh Harbor, destroyed.
Marsh Harbor finish. No more Marsh Harbor. All Marsh Harbor gone.
Winds drove a 20-foot storm surge like a river.
The apartment building, as we stay in, the whole roof came off.
You can hear fear in Gertha Joseph's voice.
People trying to make it to the other side where this white house is, but some people, the water just took them.
Joseph and other residents watched in horror
Angie, your apartment.
as the hurricane ransacked their apartments.
Oh my God, Angie, the window.
Officials had pleaded with people to evacuate.
There are some persons who have decided to shelter at the hotel at Old Bahama Bay. That is not a good idea. We are asking you to reconsider that decision.
The Bahamian Prime Minister stunned by the storm's fury.
This is probably the most saddened and worst day of my life to address the Bahamian people.
And those who didn't evacuate?
I can only say to them that I hope this is not the last time they would hear my voice.
Celebrity chef Jose Andres is in the Bahamas. His nonprofit World Central Kitchen, which helped in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, will now feed people in the Bahamas.
We plan to get there by boat, we plan to get there by plane, but we all need to wait.
As night fell, Dorian took aim at Grand Bahama Island in the city of Freeport.
Please pray for us. Please pray for us, everyone. Please pray for us.
And we want to take you live now to Freeport, which is just outside the worst weather right now on Grand Bahama. Basically, the eye wall is to the east of Freeport. Freeport, Bahama's second largest city. The area, Freeport and the suburbs, home to around 75,000. Grand Bahama Airport was reporting that they've been under 5 feet of water, which I wouldn't be surprised with that onshore push. The whole island there, Grand Bahama, 96 miles east to west, and the thickest part of the island, north to south, the widest part, is 17 miles. And Jim, you know, the eye of this thing is about 10 miles, give or take, right? It's not going to be exact. And so it's basically straddling the whole island right now.
Absolutely unbelievable when you think about this, and the fact that it's just stationary and not moving at all. Steph, you can see behind me here, You know, when you start thinking of Florida beaches, you don't think of rock cliffs like the Maine coast or the California coast, but that's what we've got here. This is called Anastasia Rock behind me, and that's why we had so many shipwrecks off the Treasure Coast, because some of these outcroppings stick out, but you can see how it's causing the water to spray up behind me here. We're about 100 miles north of Miami, by the way, just to kind of give you an idea where we are. We're north of West Palm, again on the beautiful island, Hutchinson Island through here, which is evacuation zone AB, and an area that is supposed to evacuate or being evacuating as of right now. So that is certainly something we want you to heed in that evacuation warning. Let's talk about what's happening here. Some of the outer bands, regardless of a stalled hurricane, are already coming in here. And we've gotten gusts with these anywhere from 40 to over 50 miles per hour. All right, one of them kind of knocked me off the air there for a second, but we're back on and we're at this location. You can see the close-up radar. There's the barrier island. That's zone AB, okay, where we have Jensen Beach, which is a little bit to my north. We're kind of on the southern flank of this barrier island and through here. And these bands are going to come in all day. They're going to get worse, especially as we get to tonight. We will deal with the closest point of this tomorrow. So, guys, it's not going to get any better here for a long time. We're going to deal with about 36 hours of this weather. So let's talk about how close we get, because this is where the game is played. Once this starts moving again, even though it's stationary and we do think it's going to stay off the coast, how much wobble do you get with this? All right? Does it do a loop-the-loop? Does it sit over Grand Bahama for a good part of the day? More than likely, yes. All right? But let's talk about this. 45 miles out, that's where the hurricane force winds are. Look at the closest approach to the western part of that eye wall. 16 miles offshore. If you get a half a degree wobble, now we have 16 miles of that eye wall onshore. All right? So big difference. Big difference, and we have to watch this thing as it moves to the north. And even some of the high-resolution European model data that looks at a real close, you can almost see the circular motion of the hurricane as it's forecast to stay offshore. And each one of those little wobbles is going to bring this eerily close. So here, what I'm telling you is to prepare for a Cat 1 or 2 landfall, even though we may never landfall, okay? Hurricane warnings are up. Again, the Treasure Coast, very much in this. Look at the area that we're expecting the 74 to 110 mile an hour winds. And that's without a landfall. That's without a landfall. Storm surge is going to be anywhere from 4 to 7 feet in through here, but it's the wave action that is going to beat up the beaches over the next 2 to 3 high tide cycles, and that is the issue here, Steph. A lot of beach erosion in through here, and the closer we get to that center and that eye wall means the worse the impacts are going to be. You know, we're kind of on a thin line here, as you know, with this thing, especially if it wobbles west.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just Florida, Jim. It's the Georgia coast, South Carolina, and North Carolina coast, which, you know, it's not only the shores getting eaten away, but that water rise. And I hate to compare storms, but this one is similar to Matthew, and that it's just going to hang offshore. Will you get the same outcome? No, because the strength is going to be different and the proximity to the coastline is going to be different. But let's show you how it is going to come up the shore. And for us in Georgia and South Carolina, it's a Wednesday, Thursday into Friday event, depending on the timing. It's still quite a ways away, but you've got to be ready for it. Now, we have had some showers in North Carolina this morning. That's due to a little front that's hanging over the area and not associated with Dorian. But as you look at how long it takes to get up here, I mean, listen, even off the coast of Georgia, are you talking Cat 2, maybe Cat 3 winds? Could we see power outages? Yes, I think that there's a good chance that there are going to be power outages. And then that push of water, because remember, you're at a counterclockwise flow. So if you're on the north side of this, you're going to get that onshore push. And that was one of the issues with Matthew, which was a storm that really shook everyone here and woke everyone up. At Matthew, we had record high level at the Fort Pulaski gauge at 12.56 feet. Our forecast on Wednesday is 10.9. Major flood stage is at 10 feet. And then look at all the rain that could be coming in as well. Remember, Matthew had tremendous inland flooding in North Carolina. That was just outstanding because of the storm and a front that came together, and they both just rained on out. So this is going to be a long duration event for us here. We want to leave you now with a look at the waves that we are seeing and are going to see ramp up. This is off of Stuart, Florida. You see it really crashing ashore, and again, this is still 100 miles away.
Absolute danger. The potential for these huge waves and the storm surge from the relentless water is something that virtually everyone in Florida needs to worry about.
Welcome back to the Weather Channel. Tracking Dorian. I'm meteorologist Paul Griffith live in Charleston, South Carolina. City is under mandatory evacuations, all of zones A and B here. And let's see behind me, this is low country for a reason. Lots of low-lying areas and marsh. And if we look out this way, that island out there is Castle Pinckney. And beyond that is the Atlantic Ocean, where Charleston Harbor empties into the ocean. And that's looking to the southeast. When Dorian passes by for hours and hours, we'll have an east and southeast wind pushing the Atlantic back into the harbor, pushing the harbor waters up. And if it rains here, the rain moving into the rivers being backed up, causing flooding. That's pretty much a sure thing. It's going to happen here as we head on towards Wednesday into Thursday. So a lot of what ifs and how much and how bad it will be. Let's try to get some information, some insight on what's going on right now with Dorian. Head into the National Hurricane Center, and their director, Ken Graham, is joining us again this early afternoon. And thanks for joining us. I know there's been some changes in the strength with Hurricane Dorian. What about the speed? The forward speed has slowed as well. Are there signs right now of this thing eventually taking more of that northerly turn and also accelerating, getting off those northern Bahama Islands?
Yeah, Paul, that's being the big question of the day. Winds still 155 miles an hour, so stationary right over the Bahamas. So just devastating, continuing to get that rain, continuing to get that push of water, dangerous push of water, and all the winds. Just a dangerous situation. So still stationary. We're waiting for that pull to the north, and it looks like maybe later on tonight and tomorrow is when we're going to see it. So that's the big question of the day, is when this is going to start moving north, because once that high pressure collapses, there's just nothing to steer it right now.
And the forecast takes it dangerously close to the coast of Florida, but landfall or not, the coast will be battered, still battered by strong waves. What's the surge forecast of how much of the water rise you'll have there across parts of the south and central east coast of Florida?
Yeah, the storm surge is one of the most dangerous parts of these hurricanes, and we're really looking at this 4 to 7 feet in some of these areas along the Florida coast. And we've actually, at 11 o'clock, we went ahead and started looking at the storm surge watch further north to include Georgia. So that means in 48 hours could see some of the elevated water, and we're going to keep working up the coast as the storm moves up. But this is important, 4 to 7 feet, and we build thousands of different runs into this model. So whether the storm changes, stronger winds, less winds, or left and right, bigger, smaller, faster, slower, we build all that in here. So 4 to 7 feet, if you're told to evacuate, please do so. And very important, Paul, is this water could come before the wind. So before the center of the storm, some of this water starts to rise well before the storm gets there. So if you're told to evacuate, don't wait until the water covers the road. It may be too late.
And I don't know if you can, maybe give us an inside look, inside baseball, what's going on in the model runs in terms of here across the South Carolina coastline. Any early looks on what the forecast of the water rise could be here, because we're so vulnerable in the low country here, a combination of the surge flooding as well as the rivers and perhaps the rain that Dorian could bring, also causing flood concerns.
Yeah, I like the point that you made, Paul. It's so true, because once you start putting that surge in there and that rain drains into the rivers and it backs up because of that surge, and that's why some of the water can get well inland. So with time, I mean, you think about this being Wednesday at 8 a.m., you're already starting to get that onshore flow into Georgia, and then into Thursday, South Carolina and North Carolina. So those waters will start to rise in the next couple days, and that's why we're looking at the track. But independent of this track, you can see that onshore flow, and that could just push the water into every river, and very susceptible. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, all those river inlets, and some of the higher values isn't always just right on the coast. Sometimes the water gets in these rivers gets piled up, so some of it could be a little ways inland.
All right, it's Director of the National Hurricane Center, Ken Graham. Thank you so much for your time, and kudos to all the men and women doing just thankless work there around the clock, keeping us informed. That's the National Hurricane Center Director Ken Graham. So again, the forecast does have Hurricane Dorian staying offshore, but still as a Category 2 hurricane. But we're still going to have a huge impact, not only the surge, but also potential for rain filling up the rivers here, also causing flooding as well. So we'll keep you on top of every little detail that's changed in the forecast as we continue to track Hurricane Dorian.
Sheltered, those that needed to evacuate have. Our EOC is fully activated, and all our state and local policymakers are cooperating. Resources are in place. We've executed the plan that we have in place, and everything is going smoothly. Let's just get the storm to cooperate.
That's certainly correct. We need that thing to just turn and not come any closer than it already has. What is your biggest concern, though, with Hurricane Dorian and its impacts to Stewart?
My biggest concern is the only consistent thing we've seen with Dorian is its inconsistency. The path definitely chooses, doesn't follow the models. So we're worried about it not turning northward and knocking us right in the chin.
Are there any bridges or anything that perhaps or roads that may be closed in preparation for Dorian's approach?
Absolutely. Our bridges are closed right now because we're starting to experience an increase in wind. Obviously, you're out at the beach, you can tell those waves are starting to really pick up. But most of the people that are coming over, the reason why we shut down the bridges is they were just coming over to surf. And it's just not safe to be out there surfing.
Yeah, certainly good information there. What other information or sort of word of caution do you have for those that maybe stayed behind?
Don't let your guard down. Continue to monitor weather conditions. Our press conferences, your weather channel, you'll keep everybody informed and let them know when it's safe to go back outside.
At some point, do you anticipate maybe more evacuations in your area?
No, as weather conditions deteriorate, we really don't want folks on the roads. And I think everybody,
okay.
We've monitored our roads, and there's very, very light traffic out there, mostly just public safety running around right now.
All right, thank you so much. That is Martin County Fire Chief Bill Schobel. We certainly appreciate you for your time. We wish you and your department the best of luck as Dorian progresses closer and closer towards the east coast of Florida. We're here in Vero Beach, and let me tell you, the winds are here too. You can hear them, and you can sort of see the trees and the dunes here, the debris and everything coming closer towards the shore. Occasionally, we've actually seen some trash. Yes. Bottles coming across the shore. Flip-flops also now on the ground too. But out there, about 100 miles away, Dorian is not far away. Some of the outer bands have already come through. We've got continuing coverage of this storm, not just here in Florida, but all across the southeast. We'll be right back.
Just pray that we can come out of this. Once we come out of it with our lives, we're happy.
Praying that they come out of it alive with their lives. You're watching some of the video, just incredible, undescribable. It almost looks like a washing machine as Dorian is tearing apart portions of the northwestern Bahamas. And that's just one of the many scenes we've unfortunately seen come out of that area. We do know, unfortunately, one 7-year-old child has died, and that boy's sister also missing. Welcome back into Vero Beach, Florida, and welcome back into our continuing coverage of Hurricane Dorian. I'm meteorologist Tevin Wooten. We are on the barrier island here. The winds have been strong and steady all day long. I mean, take a look at this. The Atlantic Ocean right there. You see an orange buoy. There are reefs out there, and then beyond the reefs and those buoys, that is the ocean, open ocean there. Shipwreck actually there where the United States flag is, but in between, my goodness, those waves are crashing in. Occasionally, I mean, just come down here, Austin. I'm not sure if we can show this or not, but this is a makeshift step to a hotel and a couple of businesses down here. But because the waves have been so relentless and so strong, I mean, just within the last 5 to 10 minutes, the waves have come in, impacted this area, took out sandbags. These are extremely heavy sandbags here. You can throw it and trunk it just like that. I mean, that has to be at least 30, 45 pounds of sand, but that is how strong that water is. And speaking of sand, when the winds pick up, primarily coming in from the north here as this turn or counterclockwise rotation from Dorian pushes in, we're getting pelted by sand on the backside. So at times, it's very difficult to turn around and look towards the north. Of course, towards the east and southeast, that is where Hurricane Dorian is, about 120 miles away. Hopefully it stays that way and doesn't get any close, because it's already too close for comfort, not just for people here in Vero Beach and across the state of Florida, but in Charleston, South Carolina as well, which is where we find our Paul Goodlow. Paul.
That's right, Tevin. Again, Florida getting hit today, and impacts increasing through tomorrow. Then it shifts northward on towards the Georgia coastline, even here in Charleston, South Carolina as well, the low country. You even see behind me, see some of the dark clouds. We're having a few passing showers. These are not Dorian-related showers, but just more of a nuisance shower you typically see in the late summertime here in coastal South Carolina. That is just impacting preparations. We're in the evacuation zone here, mandatory evacuations for zones A and B here across the South Carolina coastline. Interstate 26 now is only northbound. Contraflow has started, so both sides of the interstate are now moving north from Charleston to Columbia, South Carolina, until further notice. It's probably going to be until later on towards this week. The big concern here, starting later in the day, even midday on Wednesday, we'll start seeing that wind shift and start pushing the Atlantic back into the harbor, which will lead to more flooding here. The question mark is how much rain we'll get from the sky, which also concerns with flooding the rivers, which also help to flood this city and much of the low country as well. Let's go back to the studio with Dr. Postel, who has more information on Dorian and the latest on the conditions going on right now in the Bahamas. Dr. Postel.
Yeah, the conditions in the Bahamas are tempestuous, to be put it mildly. We know that there are destructive winds well over 100 miles per hour that have been in places for many, many hours. Incredibly high water rises, inundation levels likely well above 10 feet. And when you combine that, it's hard to imagine that it is survivable. But we do know that many folks are going through this. And unfortunately, it's going to continue on because Dorian is essentially not moving. You can find your spot on the map on the Florida coast and see that the weather conditions today are not that bad. We will see likely showers moving in with gusts over 40 to 50 maybe at times. But overall, the weather not too bad today. It's going to get a lot worse going forward. We still don't know exactly where Dorian is going to go. With that in mind, we have this segment here. We want you to send your hurricane questions to us on on Facebook and Twitter. And we will have the answers for you as best we can. And I'm joined right now with the director of the Atmospheric Sciences program, Dr. Marshall Shepard. I finally got that one right.
University of Georgia.
At UGA. Right, go Dogs. So let's have a look at the first question. As Dorian's wind speed comes down, will that make the tropical storm force wind span much larger?
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen is the completion, we think, of an eye wall replacement cycle, which tends to broaden the overall storm in some ways. And I think we've seen evidence of that. Although, Greg, you were saying you saw a little bit of erosion on the west side of the storm in a recent radar.
It looks like that Dorian is undergoing a bit of weakening, and storms that don't move often find themselves weakening eventually over time. But yes, that is also accompanied by, in this case, an enlargement of the wind field. So that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about the impacts from Florida. Let's go to another question. We were wondering if Bouchard was wondering if Dorian's lack of significant movement in terms of relatively static location, in other words, it's not moving, is that serving to drain some energy from the system?
Yeah, I was just talking about this because as it's sitting there, one thing that's happened is upwelling. Colder water is being brought up. So I think that's a temporary barrier on intensification, but still a very strong storm.
Strong storm and weakening a little. We'll have much more coming up.
And also meteorologist Paul Goodlow, who is in Charleston, South Carolina. And we also have you covered in the studio with Carl Parker and Liana Brackett. Again, all angles covered, including here in Fort Lauderdale. I'm meteorologist Alex Wallace. Welcome to continuing coverage of Hurricane Dorian. Again, still churning itself there and impacting parts of the northern Bahamas. Right now, Grand Bahama Island, that's the area feeling the brunt of it as it's continuing to move very, very slowly. And here in Fort Lauderdale, where we're right now underneath a tropical storm watch, we're sort of on that southern extent of where we could see those possible tropical storm conditions. We're at that southern extent, and to my left, that is to my east. That's where Dorian is right now, and we've certainly noticed here as we've worked our way through the day, those waves have come up and started to work their way on in, getting higher and higher and higher. So even again, this far south, impacts are expected to be felt. As far as the beach is concerned here for you, there's not a whole lot of folks walking on the beach or even getting into the beach. In fact, right now, there's a red flag that is up, which essentially means high surf, rip current issues out there, dangerous to be getting out into the waters, not recommended by any stretch. At this point, it's basically you're at your own risk. Although, I don't know if you can see, but behind me, there is actually a lifeguard stand. There's actually a few of them lining up and down the beach. And these lifeguard stands are actually manned, just in case someone is foolish enough to try to venture out into these waters, which again is dangerous. So here, I guess, at least in Fort Lauderdale, the beach is still open, but certainly not recommended to be getting out of that water at this point because it is just way, way too dangerous. We've all no doubt seen the issues back on off towards our east there in the Bahamas. Got some video to show you what was going on there, and no doubt about it, has been a destructive time. Unfortunately, now a deadly time as well, as we know now a 7-year-old killed from this storm. And the damage is no doubt quite dramatic. Seeing some of these pictures, it is really, really unbelievable. But you have to think about just how powerful this storm system has been and continues to be, lashing this area for hours and hours and hours and hours. Just it's unbelievable some of the damage that has been sustained there. We do want to get back now to the studio now, talk to Carl Parker now. And Carl, of course, the big focus is what is next, what's going to be happening next over the next 24, 48 hours. We're still certainly on alert east coast of Florida and for the rest of the southeast coast.
Yeah, no question about that, Alex. And we certainly could be looking at a landfall down the road, perhaps into North Carolina, which we'll show you here in a moment. So a Category 4 storm right now with 155-mile-per-hour winds, still an incredibly powerful storm, unimaginable violence occurring in the Bahamas here over the last couple of days. And let's take a look at the forecast track and intensities from the scientists at the Hurricane Center. And it still looks like the storm is going to be offshore, but there is that chance that it's a little closer to the coast in Florida. And then as the coast moves a little out more into the cone there, into parts of North Carolina in particular, that's where we could be looking at a landfall. The storm is likely going to be weakening at that time. The shear is going to be increasing as it moves farther to the north and to the east, but still indirect impacts all the way up the coast, and perhaps some direct impacts more towards North Carolina Thursday and going into Friday. There you see the satellite picture, and you see just how close this unbelievably powerful storm has been to the coast there. Take a look at the distance. This is just remarkable when you think about this. 90 miles. 90 miles. That's the distance between the eye wall, that most dangerous part of the hurricane, and the Florida coast. That's how close it is at this point, and it's going to get closer most likely. It's going to continue to drift a little farther to the west. You look at the radar picture right now, we have seen what is called an eye wall replacement cycle, where the inner eye wall collapsed and outer eye wall is taking over at this point. And oftentimes what happens is we see a decrease in intensity, which we have seen, but also we see a gradual expansion of the area of strongest winds. And so there's still very much concern about what is going to happen along the coast of Florida. Right now, with the official forecast, it appears that the hurricane force winds are going to come very close to the coast, especially the Space Coast there, because it sort of juts out into the water. That's certainly an area where we could be looking at some hurricane force winds. So there are hurricane warnings in effect right now, and those from Martin County, St. Lucie County, on up into Brevard County as well, right up into Daytona Beach, and hurricane watches on either side of those. So this is the wind potential map. And you see along that 95 corridor from just north of Palm Beach County up into the Space Coast, Treasure Coast, and towards Daytona Beach. That's where we could be looking at hurricane force winds, and of course winds driving on shore, storm surge, battering waves, coastal flooding. It's going to be a heck of a time there along the coast over the next several days. And then here up into Georgia and South Carolina as well, potential for tropical storm force and also hurricane force winds. And here's the latest model. This is the European model, showing you that core of the storm just offshore, Alex, but a very small deviation in the track is going to dramatically raise the stakes. It's going to amplify all of those threats along the coast. And then, of course, as we expect the core of the storm to be closer to the coast into South and North Carolina, we're going to see a lot of very serious effects there as well. So let's get back out to Alex Wallace in Fort Lauderdale. And, you know, Alex, sort of remarkable when you look at the satellite, you look at the radar picture, you know, you go back 20, 30 years, if you'd been looking at a storm that strong, that close to the coast, there'd be much less confidence that the storm was going to lift north. But that's how much forecasting has changed in the last few decades.
You said it, Carl. I was thinking about this morning when I woke up. I was like, my goodness, first of all, thank God we even have satellites to know that this thing is out there. And as you mentioned, the second point, these computer models to let us know that there is expected to be that northward turn. Otherwise, you know, the folks here would just be thinking this thing's going to slam right on into the east coast of Florida. So absolutely, thank goodness that we have all of these tools to figure out what's going on with this particular hurricane. One of the other things that certainly is a concern is what's going to be happening out into the waters. And Carl, as you mentioned, even if the best case scenario stays offshore here for us, we still find ourselves dealing with impacts, and that coming in the form of, well, some of those waves. What are we looking at in terms of wave heights and some of those arrival times for some of the biggest waves?
Yeah, wave height's certainly a very big concern here, Alex. We're talking about wave heights that could get above 20 feet, maybe even higher in some areas. I do think we have a graphic for that. See if we can get that for you. But that's going to be slowly working up and along the coast. And here's the European model forecast there. And you can see just how slow the motion is between Tuesday and Wednesday. And already you've got an enormous wave field associated with the storm. So, you know, very high waves just offshore, but we could be looking at waves of easily 5 to 10 to 15 feet coming into the coastline, depending on exactly how close the storm gets to the coastline. Alex?
All right, well, no doubt we'll be monitoring this very, very closely here over the next several hours. All eyes here on eastern Florida, as well as up and down the southeast coast as well. Lots to follow here for us when it comes to what's going on as we're dealing with here. Again, north of me, there are a number of areas that are dealing with evacuation issues. There are travel issues as well to be concerned with. Just a number of problems that we are going to continue to focus in on here as we work our way on through the next day, 2, 3, and even beyond, because this thing, again, is moving so very slowly, essentially at a standstill, stationary for the most part, moving very, very slowly. So the question becomes, of course, when does that turn towards the north begin to take place? But no doubt there's been a lot of preparation that has been ongoing out there across, again, not just here in eastern Florida, but working up into even Georgia, sliding your way up into the Carolinas as well, as they are now watching for this potential major system to try to move its way on in. Again, right now, it looks like most possibilities keep the core of the storm offshore, but that does not mean the impacts will not be felt. We've certainly been noticing the waves crashing on in, and more of that is expected here for us as the system continues to, again, get a little closer and then eventually move its way up the coast. There's what's going on. You see where I'm located, and you can see essentially where that eye of the storm is. I mean, I tell you, it is not too far away. And again, fortunately, we are forecasting to see this thing turn on off towards the north. Otherwise, we would be talking about just an incredible storm slamming right onto the east coast. Again, those possibilities becoming less and less, not zero. So we still want to keep our guard up. And I want to say that that is something that I have noticed. People keeping their guard up and still prepared. Had a lot of time to prepare here in the Fort Lauderdale area, getting into these zones. And that has certainly been a good thing. The slow movement has allowed people to prepare well out ahead of the storm. So that has allowed them to now sort of sit down and sort of wait on what is going to be happening out there for us. And it looks like here in the Fort Lauderdale area, we'll be looking at some of those winds on the increase as we work our way through the rest of this afternoon. Into tonight, we could be looking at 45-mile-per-hour wind gusts, possible, maybe a little bit stronger than that. So again, getting into that tropical storm force range, that's why we are under a tropical storm watch at this point. And can't rule out some of that rain coming in as well. 1 to 2 inches here, with even more possible as you work your way north. Again, very dependent on the track of this particular hurricane. Let's work our way northbound now and check in with meteorologist Tevin Wooten. And Tevin, you've been hanging out there in Vero Beach. You've seen some occasional rain coming on through
Bahamas, and it's going to come very, very close to the U.S. here in the next couple of days and could very well make a landfall farther down the road late this week in North Carolina. And let's take a look at the new advisory from the Hurricane Center. Again, as I mentioned, a Category 4 storm, so coming down in intensity, somewhat still an incredibly powerful storm, and it's just not moving at all today. No changes in this latest advisory to any of the warnings. Hurricane warnings are now up from Martin County into St. Lucie County, farther northward, Indian River, into Brevard and Volusia County as well. Hurricane watches to the south, Palm Beach County, and then on up towards Jacksonville, as hurricane force conditions are expected in these areas. The storm making a very, very close pass just off to the east. And again, the model guidance has really settled in on the idea of the storm being just offshore, but a very small deviation in that track would bring more of the impacts on land in Florida. And then farther down the road, we think there could be a landfall, or it's going to be very close to it in eastern North Carolina. But at that time, the storm is not going to be the same storm. Still, a very powerful storm. Still, we're going to see serious impacts in the Carolinas, but we're looking at a storm that is likely going to be starting to come down in intensity, still forecast to be a Category 2 hurricane as it approaches North Carolina. Take a look at the loop here. This is over the last 24 hours, and you can see there is a difference in the character of the storm. You see the dark colors in what we call the CDO, or central dense overcast. You see a lot more of that dark color 24 hours ago as it was coming into the Bahamas. So at that time, the storm was, as we mentioned, one of the very worst storms that we have ever seen in the Atlantic Basin. It's still an incredibly powerful storm. It started up so high, even though it has weakened, it is certainly not weak. It's far from that. Still an unbelievably powerful storm, and again, just not moving right now on Grand Bahama Island. Freeport, very close to, if not actually into the eye wall of the storm. And you can see how close this storm came to South Florida. 80 miles is the distance from the coast to the eye wall, and it may continue to drift farther west. It could get even closer. So that's how close it's going to be to an unmitigated disaster there in South Florida. This is a look at the radar picture over the last 12 hours. And what we've seen is what's called an eye wall replacement cycle, where the inner eye wall collapses and a secondary eye wall takes over. Usually that means a degradation of the eye wall and the intensity, but also we see the wind field spreading out, which may have some implications farther down the road. That could mean some stronger winds as the storm works up and along the coast. But right now, we're not seeing very strong winds, as those strongest of winds are really confined to the central part of the storm. There you see the broader perspective here and just how close this storm came. And I want to show you the European model ensemble members. And right now, the preponderance of the evidence suggests that it's going to be an offshore track. But you see there are some members here that do drift the storm even farther west and take it up and along the coast or even inland. And so, Felicia, again, as we've been saying over the last couple of days, many, many times, we do not want people in Florida to feel comfortable at this point, because by no means are we sure that the storm is going to be offshore at this time.
And, you know, I think that is such a point that we have to keep hammering home. People who have been watching the coverage kind of continuously might be, okay, you know, we get the point, but we can't say it enough, because some people are starting to get complacent. They think, oh, the storm's going to stay offshore, but this is such a monster of a storm. Those hurricane and tropical storm force winds, of course, extend out from the eye, and we don't know exactly what the storm is going to do yet. There have been so many changes with the models with this particular storm, so just stay vigilant and know that there are going to be impacts regardless. Now, I'm here right now with the mayor of Tybee Island, Mayor Jason Buhlerman, and we're talking to him a little bit about some of the things that people need to know. So I drove in on Highway 80 from Savannah, and I noticed that the water is already very, very close. So what are your thoughts on that particular highway and maybe flooding and maybe it becoming very hard to get to Tybee Island?
Well, the main concern with that is relative to evacuations. That's why it's so important that people heed the governor's evacuation orders. Don't find themselves out here on Wednesday with that track coming a little bit closer to us and not being able to get off the island because the causeway is covered with water. So that's obviously our biggest fear. So we're trying to make sure that people heed that evacuation order and get out of here before that happens, and before the arrival of tropical storm force winds, which you guys are telling us is going to be sometime Wednesday.
Yeah. And so what you've been here, you said you've been here for 20 years. What has been your experience the past few years of Michael and Irma and how that's impacted Tybee Island?
Well, with Matthew in 2016, a lesson from that was that it doesn't have to hit you directly to have a significant impact. That could be the situation with this, where it brushes us but still brings some significant damage in terms of surge, in terms of wind damage, roof damage, etc. And then with Irma, which didn't even come anywhere close to us, we had the worst surge from that storm than Tybee's had for the last 50 years. So we haven't seen all the surge models yet. And a lot of that will depend on the ultimate track. But my biggest concern from this is surge. I know that's what can cause loss of life more than anything is water. So we're most worried about the impact of surge. And this particular area is much more vulnerable to storm surge than parts of Florida and North Carolina. So the water is very shallow, going very far out here. So we know that we're vulnerable to surge, and that's like I said, my #1 concern.
And you're from here, you live here. How are people feeling right now?
I mean, obviously everybody's a little nervous. You see what's happening in the Bahamas. I mean, I pray for those people. They're dealing with a absolute catastrophe down there, and they don't have anywhere to go. At least people here, you know, you have somewhere you can go and get to safety, go to Atlanta, go where points north, whatever. But you know, most residents are heeding the evacuation. I think there are some who are not, who are kind of waiting to see what happens with this. But to them, I would say 2 things. #1, this thing can shift closer towards us, and that would bring significant impacts. And #2, if it stays on its current projected center line of that cone, we're still going to see significant impacts, and you don't want to be on the island when you're experiencing hurricane force winds.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So is there anything that you want everyone watching to know about Tybee Island and the preparation and what you're doing to get ready for this?
No, I think you guys are doing a great job. We're coordinating with the county emergency, Georgia emergency, Governor Kemp, everybody. I think they're all doing a good job. So just be vigilant, stay informed of what's going on, and don't wait till the last minute to evacuate, especially if this thing looks like it's going to get closer. This storm's been completely unpredictable. And so that's the only thing we know about Dorian is we don't know what it's going to do. And we need to keep that in mind because this is a monster and it's headed this way. Even if it weakens a little bit, if the track shifts this way, we could be in for some very severe consequences.
Jason, all really great points. Thank you so much for being with us. So that was the mayor of Tybee Island, and you know, all great points that he was making. I mentioned I drove Highway 80 in, and the water was already very close there. The surf is already incredibly rough here. So everyone here really needing to take this seriously. Now we want to get back down to Fort Lauderdale, where we have our own Alex Wallace. How's it looking there, Alex?
Doing all right. Thanks so much, Felicia. Yeah, here in Fort Lauderdale, where we've been dealing with some of these passing showers from the Outer Banks.
Brush the coast, the east coast of Florida, if it were to take that track. But remember, again, that there could be just a little bit of deviation from that path, and a little bit of deviation to the west is going to dramatically amplify the stakes here. It's going to bring up the potential for wind and rain and surge. Everything is going to be raised if the storm does manage to track a little bit farther to the west. So with that in mind, we have what is the worst case scenario here, the wind potential in Florida, and that could mean some winds, hurricane force winds along the east coast of Florida, perhaps in Palm Beach County, then getting up to St. Lucie County, also into Brevard, and then further north into Volusia County as well. That's where we could be looking at those hurricane force winds as the storm passes just off to the east, and particularly if the wind field expands or if the track is a little bit to the left of the official forecast right now. And then tropical storm force winds extending fairly far inland, perhaps all the way to Orlando. And of course, we're going to be looking at battering waves at this time. The beach is going to be just pounded by waves and some surge, maybe 4 to 7 feet of water level rise there. Then farther north, you're looking at winds of potentially hurricane force in parts of eastern Georgia, and then tropical storm force fairly far inland, and then farther north as well. The product just doesn't extend that far at this time, but certainly up into North Carolina as well. So looking at the hurricane wind speed probabilities, they're up to about 40 to 50% along the coast right now, and then extend farther north. But this is a function of time as well, and we do expect that these probabilities are going to be coming way up there along parts of the coast in South and North Carolina. And Alex, could be looking at a landfall from the hurricane. Right now, the forecast for a Category 2 storm to be passing either right over or very close to eastern North Carolina, maybe around Cape Fear and towards the Outer Banks as well. So we've got a really long way to go with this storm.
Yeah, Carl, you said it, and that's the thing, just a long way to go. A lot of folks have prepared so far ahead out of this thing, which is exactly what we want to be doing. The earlier you prepare, the better off you're going to be as we await the storm and that turn towards the north and eventual potential landfall here somewhere along the southeast coast. Even if that does not occur, as we've been talking about over and over and over again, still feeling some impacts. In fact, here in Fort Lauderdale, I mean, we're well away from the center of the circulation, but you're getting those outer bands and you'll get some of those brief downpours. You notice the waters, they're certainly a lot more choppy. Here on the beach itself, red flag is up, which essentially means don't get into the water. It's just not safe to do so. We got the high surf, we got the rip current issues out there for us as well. Now, although the lifeguard stands, which are kind of lining up and down this block here, these areas are certainly manned, but they still don't want folks getting out there into that water. It is just. And now, what is your focus and your main concern when it comes to Dorian at this hour?
We're also waiting on that movement. I mean, you can see just almost still stationary. So very slow movement, still battering the Bahamas. But look, we start having all these rain bands at your location of Fort Lauderdale and beyond. I mean, that's stretching across almost all of Florida here. You can get some gusts 40 to 50 mile an hour in some of these rain bands. So got to be careful, and we're going to watch for this movement towards the north.
And you mentioned that movement towards the north. I know there's been a lot of concerns, viewers asking, you know, is there still that possibility that this thing stays moving westbound and we don't see that northward turn take shape?
Yeah, a couple things have built our confidence. Even the slowdown is due to this high pressure that was pushing this towards the west. And we knew that collapsed as this thing stalled. So we're just waiting on this system up in the eastern part of the country to develop and pull it north. I think we're going to start seeing that tonight and into tomorrow. But the question is how close we get to the coast. However, impacts well outside that center. I mean, tropical storm force winds miles away from the center, and this thing is expanding.
Hey, you know, I mentioned it earlier, you know, in the sort of early lifespan of this thing, it was really, really small, now beginning to widen out a bit, which means the impacts would certainly be a little bit larger than that. Thanks again to National Hurricane Center Director Ken Graham there. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk with him a bit later. But again, letting you know again that the impacts, it's not just a center point. A hurricane, it is not just a point. You get the impact stretching well outside of that, and we're no doubt dealing with that here across the eastern portions of Florida, and even points northbound as we work our way through time, even into places across southeast Georgia. And in fact, that's where we want to head to now with our meteorologist Felicia Combs. They're on Tybee Island, and Felicia, no doubt.
Complete devastation.
Now it's a waiting game. Definitely impact portions of Florida.
The weather's going to get a whole lot worse.
Just some of the horrifying images of some of the impacts that Dorian has already had, and certainly all eyes on the southeast coast on what is going on. Continue. Satellite image, still a powerful beast of a storm, which you can see is with its outer bands certainly reaching the southeast coast of Florida with some of those gusty winds and some of those heavy downpours. But the center of the circulation, that main part of where the strongest of those winds are, still lashing parts of the northern Bahamas, Grand Bahama Island. That's the area that continues to feel some of those impacts, the worst of these impacts right now. And boy, I tell you, it has been just an incredible amount of time to have to deal with the brunt of the system. But we continue to have you covered up and down the southeast coast here. We've got you here in Fort Lauderdale. I'm here, meteorologist Alex Wallace, but we also have Felicia Combs, who is hanging out there on Tybee Island. We got also all sorts of folks. Paul Goodlow, who's been hanging out there in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as Tevin Wooten, who's been hanging out there on Vero Beach. So there's been a lot of folks hanging out to make sure that we are covering this story for you and making sure you are prepared, not just in the field, but also in the studio where we have meteorologist Liana Brackett and our storm specialist Carl Parker as well. So all angles covered, as well as including here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Behind me here, as you can see, not a whole lot of folks. And you got to remember, hey, this is Labor Day. We're Labor Day weekend. Folks want to try to get in that last bit of beach time here before we sort of unofficially close out summer. But you don't see this place lined up with a whole lot of folks. There have been a few straggling here and there, but all in all, for a typical Labor Day, it has been very, very quiet indeed. Certainly, again, the few folks that have been straggling along the beach, they've been doing just that, straggling along and not getting out into those waters, which have gotten much, much choppier. We've seen those wave heights increase as well as we continue to watch Dorian churn those waters here. That's where those waves come from, those really strong and powerful winds churning those waters and then sending those waves towards the shore. So that's what we're seeing here all the way in South Florida. The beach right now is under a red flag at this point. Looks like this is the first time we've been out here all morning and in the afternoon. Right down towards behind me here, there's a couple, two folks who are in the water. Those are the first two I've seen get into the water all day. And right now, they're basically swimming at their own risk. Yes, the lifeguards are manning these stations, but there's a red flag that is in place right now, which essentially means you really got to be mindful of trying to get into that water because we're dealing with high surf issues and rip current problems as well. So it's probably not the smartest situation to be getting out into that water. Not recommended. Again, right now, the beaches are manned, but don't get into that water. We don't want some folks having to have to be rescued. That's what we got here in Fort Lauderdale. Of course, the Bahamas, we've been talking about what's been going on there. Just incredible scenes of destruction from this extreme hurricane. Again, at one point got up to 185 miles per hour, those sustained winds. Second strongest hurricane on record in the Atlantic. And look at some of these scenes. I mean, you've got some of these trees that have been stripped clean. Lots of damage for some of these homes. We've seen cars receiving damage, boats that are flipped upside down. It has just been an incredible scenario and a situation that has taken shape here in and across parts of the Bahama Islands. You got basically Abaco's Islands there for us. Of course, right now we're seeing Grand Bahama Island feeling some of the brunt of the impacts. And the problem is it's been so prolonged. This has not been a situation where we've been dealing with for an hour and then we're done. No, we're talking several hours, half a day's worth of having to deal with these extreme winds, which no area is going to be able to sustain that. All right, let's get back to the studio now, back to the lab now, and bring in our storm specialists, Carl Parker and Carl. A powerful system even still here. Again, we've been talking about that great peak at 185, and it's come down a bit. It's almost tough to even say it's weakened. I want to put that in quotes because this is still a very powerful and dangerous storm. Yeah, that's a really important point. It's still an incredibly powerful storm. It came from being an unimaginably powerful storm to now being an incredibly powerful storm. 150 mile per hour winds, category 4. Of course, you saw some of the catastrophic tornado-like damage there in the Bahamas with 20-foot storm surge on top of that, and the storm now moving to the west at 1 mile per hour. The forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center pretty similar to what we've seen over the last day or so, last couple of days. Still expecting the storm to track just offshore relative to Florida, but that could change. A small deviation in the track could bring more impacts onshore in Florida. And then as the storm continues up and past North Carolina, could still be a category 2 at that time and could very well make landfall or come very close to it in eastern parts of North Carolina, anywhere from Cape Fear and up and across the Outer Banks. That would be later in the week towards Thursday and Friday. This is a loop over the last 24 hours. A couple of things to pick out here. One is that you see less of that really dark color in that donut around the eye in the latter part of the loop. So again, it's gone from being an unimaginably powerful storm to one that is still very, very strong. But the other thing that you notice is that in the early part of the loop, the storm was moving slowly across Great Abaco Island. But what has happened since then is that the upper flow has completely relaxed and it is just sitting in the same areas. It's really not moving at all at this time. And look how close it has come to the state of Florida. This is what had so many people worried here. Of course, it's been just an awful, horrible situation in the Bahamas, but we were worried that that's exactly what we would be facing in South Florida. And we're not out of the woods yet. At this point, that eye wall, that most dangerous part of the storm, is now only 80 miles offshore relative to South Florida. The modeling continues to be consistent, continues to show that it is going to turn to the north, but look how close it is to the southern tip of the state of Florida there. And what the modeling is looking at are disturbances, initially a weaker one and then eventually a stronger one coming down in that northwest flow. But right now they appear to be more subtle features in the imagery, but the modeling has been very consistent about the turn. What is less consistent is where exactly that is going to occur. So this is the European ensemble guidance, and we're getting new guidance coming in right now. And you see they all show that there is a turn, but where exactly does that occur? Does it happen more quickly, or does the storm drift even farther to the west? And some of these ensemble members actually do take the storm onshore or very close to it. So by no means are more serious impacts in Florida
off the table at this point. It's just that the preponderance of evidence is that the track is going to be just offshore relative to Florida, maybe to Georgia, but then getting closer to the coast as you move up into South Carolina and into North Carolina. Here's a look at the latest NHC track, and you see the hurricane force winds, and you notice how close they will get there to the Treasure Coast, to the Space Coast. Those areas in particular could be in for some hurricane force winds, and that's why hurricane warnings are now up. Martin, St. Lucie, Indian River, Brevard, and Volusia counties, in all of those areas, we could be looking at hurricane force winds tomorrow and going into Wednesday. And let's go back out to Alex now. And Alex is starting to get some tropical storm force winds there along the coast in Florida. Juno Beach actually reporting winds gusting to 48 miles an hour, one of my favorite beaches there in Florida.
All right, and there you go. It just goes to show you, again, you don't have to have that center move on through to find some of those big impacts here. So again, we're still not out of the woods, and we're going to continue to drive that point home. And Carl, you pointed out some of those ensemble members here when it comes to the forecast models, and how there's a number of them that do remain offshore, which is exactly what we want to see. But even in the best case scenario, even if it's farthest to the east, still going to be finding some of those impacts when it comes to these waters, still remaining choppy, rip current risk, high wave action out there for us as well. That is still quite a bit of a concern.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, when you look at the winds here and what we're expecting in terms of winds across the region, they could be very strong indeed. Here you see winds perhaps gusting to a hurricane force along the coast, and that would be anywhere from the eastern part of Palm Beach County and over into Indian River and Martin, as I mentioned, over towards the Space Coast. And so, you know, what that implies is not just the wind, but of course, the wind that is driving into the coast all the way along as the storm is coming up and along the coast. So a water level rise of 4 to 7 feet will be possible. But again, that is highly dependent on the exact track of the storm, but also very large waves are going to be generated by the storm of 5 to 15 feet coming into the coastline. And that too can also raise the water levels. That's called wave run up and wave set up. So this is going to be devastating for a lot of the beaches, and maybe very similar to what we saw with Hurricane Matthew in 2017, with some surge coming up there, particularly towards northern Florida and parts of Georgia, and then even into South Carolina and North Carolina, even though the storm is going to be less intense by that time. So yes, you know, even though you're absolutely right, Alex, even though we may be looking at an offshore track, it's not as if though we're not going to see much weather. And here's a look at the wave height forecast. And you see in pink there, those are wave heights of over 20 feet. So that's just offshore. And then in the blue color, that's wave heights of 10 to 15 feet. So that's coming right up and into the coast and really giving those beaches a workout. And, you know, that's at a minimum, most likely. That's the least that we're going to see. But if you do move that core closer, more over to the west, closer to the coast, then you're going to be looking at a great amplification of all of those effects, Alex.
All right, indeed. We'll be continuing to monitor that, that's for sure, as we head on through the coming days. Back here in Fort Lauderdale, where the waves continue to crash on in, and we're seeing a few more folks kind of venturing out into those waters, which we really don't recommend. It is not safe to be doing so, at least right here in Fort Lauderdale. The beach is not closed yet, but there is a red flag that is in place, so that basically means don't get into the water. It's just not safe to do so at this point. Even though the stations are manned, the lifeguard stations, why make the lifeguards work? There's no reason for them to have to come out there and rescue in what is still dangerous waters right now. Radar picture showing you where the rain continues to sort of spiral its way on in. We've seen a couple of rain bands sneak their way on in, some heavy tropical downpours. They've been moving on in here into South Florida, and that will continue to be the case. Again, you see the center of the circulation, again, still well on off towards the east. But again, still way too close to comfort, and we see some of those bands that continue to spiral on in. One now just on off towards our north. That'll eventually begin to move right back on into our neck of the woods. So we'll be watching that very closely, and we think that's going to be the general theme for the rest of the day. We bring in those downpours, those gusty winds, and then we get a bit of a break like we're seeing right now. No rainfall for us at this hour, but like that, it'll move on in and then move right on out. But still,
of 30 millibars is the right trend. Those are the trends we want to see continue here. It's not necessarily been because we've had an interaction with the Bahamas. They've had very little influence on the strength of this. It's been A little bit of weak wind shear out there. It's been the steering currents as a whole, and it's been this eye wall replacement cycle, which tends to weaken hurricanes as a whole here. So that's all good stuff. Those are all good things for us here, folks. And so I think at this point, if we can take any good news out of this, it's that northerly trend is now, I think, going to be our friend, especially with a stationary hurricane at this moment. So we're going to keep you updated on this, but I want to get you to Georgia tonight. Governor Brian Kemp is conducting a live press conference at this moment. Let's listen in.